again to growing sweet potatoes in the Pacific Northwest. The outline for today is here. So we'll try to talk about why you might want to grow sweet potatoes in the Pacific Northwest and how to do it. We'll go through everything from choosing varieties to storing the harvest. And then Laura's going to share some preliminary results from her trials in Mount Vernon. Okay, so there's a lot of confusion about sweet potatoes. There's some sweet potatoes that are called yams, but it's very, very rare actually to find yams for sale in the United States unless you're going to a very specific store that sells ethnic foods. So even the things that are called yams in the grocery store, any regular, Western grocery store is actually a sweet potato. Sweet potatoes and yams and potatoes are all in different plant families. So yams are in the Dioscoraceae family, potatoes are Solanaceae, and sweet potatoes are Convolvulaceae. So they're actually related to bindweed. And the fact that sweet potatoes are not related to tomatoes or regular potatoes is actually an advantage on your farm, because if you grow sweet potatoes, you're adding a crop that's unrelated to anything else you grow, unless you happen to have bindweed as a weed. So that can help you with your rotations. Sweet potatoes are an incredibly nutritious root crop. The greens are also pretty high in all sorts of good things. Sweet potatoes are produced widely throughout the world, and they're 7th in world food production, along with corn and wheat and all those things. The consumption of sweet potatoes is rising across the United States. So just in between 2000 and 2014, the consumption almost doubled. So it's a popular crop. In the United States, sweet potatoes are traditionally grown in the Southeast and California. So it's a little bit unusual to try to grow them here. But we do have farmers who are interested. I know some of you in the audience have tried growing sweet potatoes before. And the farmers that we've talked to that want to grow sweet potatoes, I mean, we're all interested in growing a new crop. But if you're direct marketing, it's nice to have more diversity in what you can offer. And then it's pretty common for folks who have food sensitivities to be able to eat sweet potatoes. So this is a crop that you can market for folks that have trouble with some other crops. Sweet potatoes require a minimum of 4 months of frost-free growing time, and they love warm temperatures. So the ideal temperatures are 77 to 85 degrees, the air temperature, and the soil temperature 65 to 85 degrees. So we sometimes get that, but yeah, so it's a little bit marginal here, but there's other things that make up for that. Planting in loose soil is a benefit. Just they're easier to harvest when the soil is loose and porous, and they really need consistent moisture to grow well. In our area, the yields can be comparable or even higher than the national average, just because we have a longer day length here in the summer, and that can make up for lack of heat. The longer day length promotes root growth, so that's an advantage that we have above other growing regions, but it doesn't make up for all the lack of heat that we have. So so here we need short to mid-season varieties to grow, so you can get a harvest before it gets too cold. And it helps to use something to warm the soil. So black plastic mulch is typically used, but there's some farmers that are trying other options, which we'll talk about later. And then you may not actually need black plastic in some areas. There's actually one farm that we've worked with in Kitsap County that doesn't use black plastic, and they get a great harvest each year. So it really depends on microclimates. So one of the first things to do is choose a good variety to grow here. Folks are often tempted to just go to the grocery store and say, wow, those are really cool purple sweet potatoes. I want to grow those. So I'll try to grow them from these things at the store. We don't recommend going to the store to get sweet potatoes because you don't know what variety they are. Here is a list of a sampling of varieties that are being grown on the research station in Mount Vernon, so we can vouch for them. We tend to recommend the short season ones are 90 to 100 days to maturity. The mid-season ones are 100 to 115. And there's a later chart. We'll show some later season varieties, but these are just some characteristics. The flesh color, skin color, the growth habit is important for weed management and other things, but we'll talk about that later. And then you'll notice in the last column, we talk about the susceptibility to wireworms. We really are focusing on wireworms in this research because wireworms are the biggest barrier to growing sweet potatoes, at least the pest and disease barrier that organic farms have here. So getting resistant varieties is really helpful where other tools aren't available. And the reason for the yield here, the reason some of them don't have yields listed, that's just because there isn't data available from the research station trials, and we may or may not have that in the future. Actually, Laura, Mahon yam and O. Henry aren't being grown on the research station. Is Georgia jet?
No.
So I guess we won't have that to compare, but anyway. Okay, so for growing sweet potatoes, you can buy slips from various seed suppliers, but you can also grow your own. One of the biggest expenses of growing sweet potatoes is actually buying the slips. When you're importing plant material from someplace else, you also have the potential to bring diseases with it. So if you can do the production on the farm, if you have the capacity and the conditions to do that, you can save some money, and it's a good first step in your integrated pest management plan. So one sweet potato root can grow 10 to 20 slips, sometimes more, depending how you treat it. It really varies by the variety. For example, one of the varieties on the list, Cascade, that one of the ones that we grow, that one is the one that just jumps up and produces slips really early and quickly, and other ones take a little bit more time. So there's some kind of playing around with which sweet potato varieties produce the most slips or the best slips. When you're producing your own slips, you want to choose healthy, undamaged roots. So if they've got, weird blotches on them, skip those. If they had a big cut on them, that even if it's healed, you should use undamaged sweet potatoes for the slip production, just so they don't rot. So when you get the roots, you put them in trays filled with potting soil. So you can see the photographs here. We just use, typical trays, and you can use any seed starting mix. You don't cover them all the way, just partially, leaving the tops kind of poking out. And then you have to give them nice warm conditions. And this is kind of, since these conditions are so different than starting other seeds, this is where farmers often have trouble with this. So we recommend putting them on a heat mat, and then also covering them with a plastic dome or creating some type of, tent structure that keeps the heat in. And then you just have to keep them moist, but not soggy. And if you, when you put the plastic dome on it, or if you can create a tent to keep the heat in, you just want to make sure that you don't have a bunch of condensation. It will take 2 to 3 weeks for the sweet potatoes to start sprouting. So give them great conditions and just be patient. And then the entire process, usually we recommend giving 6 to 8 weeks to produce slips that are ready for planting. If you don't have ideal conditions, that 85 degrees, then it can take longer. So if you don't know if you can keep up the heat and humidity, you might give yourself a little bit extra time for growth. We recommend cutting the slips above the soil, and that's just because if you happen to have any disease material in the soil, that will avoid transmitting it. But if you have clean seed starting mix, then you don't really have to worry about that. When you cut the slips, they should have 5 to 7 nodes, and then you would take the leaves off the lower nodes. So you can see here there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 nodes, and then you just strip the leaves off. So you can plant them right away, or you can store them. Just you don't have to store them in water. You can just store them in crates, but you want to keep them in the shade. And the slides is a cool, shady place, but I think cool for a warm area. When we say cool, it should be above 60 degrees. You don't want to put them in the refrigerator. Refrigerating any sweet potato materials will damage them, so the slips or the roots. So we don't recommend ever refrigerating them. Just letting the slips kind of sit out and wilt for a while can actually be a good thing. Laura was talking about, actually, Laura, do you want to talk about the study?
Sure. Yeah, so there was a study done looking at how long you hold slips before you plant them. So they looked at planting slips immediately after you cut them off those trays and then letting them sit for up to 4 days. And they found that the hormones in the slip changes as it sits. And so it kind of initiates root development. So if you let them sit for like 1 to 3 days, that's kind of your ideal window. And then when you plant them, they start producing roots right away and you end up with higher yields. So that is kind of a generally recommended practice, though you can totally plant them right away. It will be fine, but yields are maybe higher if you let them sit for a couple days.
Yeah. So it's one of the few times I've ever seen somebody say, "Oh, take the cutting and let it sit out for a while." Okay, so some of you guys may be familiar with folks pre-rooting the slips by just, some people put them in 4-inch pots, or some people try it in water. Some people will do it in smaller pots. You can pre-root the slips. It's good for if you order slips through the mail and you just aren't going to get to them right away. It's essentially healing them in soil. And you can leave them for, up to a couple, several weeks. Also, if you pre-root them, that can help you. We think we're kind of trying it out this year, but you might get a head start if you are in a cooler location. Because when you plant the slips directly, you'll see that they sit there for like 2 or 3 weeks and don't do anything, and they might even look dead, but then they start growing again. So we're kind of curious to see if pre-rooting them will save you that, 2 to 3 weeks of getting over the transplanting process. But if you do pre-root them, you should not let them become root bound, because those first roots that are produced are actually what turn into the roots. So you'll get these kind of squirrely roots that are the shape of the pot that you put it in. So just be careful with that. Like I said, some farmers will use 4-inch pots. There's one farmer that we've worked with who puts like 50 slips in a 1-gallon pot. And then they just kind of take out the whole, upend the pot and shake all the soil off and then plant them that way. So you can try different things.
Laurel, I'm just going to jump in. We had a question in the chat about how long to let your slips sit if you ordered them in the mail. In that case, I would plant them right away. I would assume the time in the mail is, going to be about 1 to 4 days. So I would not definitely not let them sit any longer. If you like absolutely cannot plant them right away, you're going to want to put them either in water, like with a wet paper towel, or you could put them in potting mix. But yeah, at that point, it's probably already been 4 days. You'll want to do something with them right away.
Yeah, and in fact, if you've ordered your slips, sometimes they get to you in not the best condition. So if you can't get to them right away, you should at least look through them, pick through them, and lay them out, because if they might be packed together in a bundle, and the interior slips can start rotting. So if you mail order them and you can't get it to them right away, it's a good idea to take them out, inspect them, and separate them a little bit and give them some nice treatment. Okay, you can put them in water for just carrying them over a couple days, but we don't recommend rooting them in water, just because the roots that are produced in water they're more fragile than the roots that will be produced in soil. So planting unrooted slips is the norm in the sweet potato industry. But that doesn't mean that pre-rooting them can't be an extra tool for our cooler climate. So we're looking into that. For transplanting the slips out into the field, we recommend waiting for 2 or 3 weeks after the last frost. And we didn't put a temperature on here, but the ideal soil temperature is 60, 65 degrees. You do not want to put these in cold soil. So the reason you wait that long is for the air and the soil to warm up. And in fact, it would help to put the black plastic on the soil a little bit ahead of time to get ahead, even more warming going. Let's see. So there's plant spacing recommended between 8 and 15 inches, but Laura has conducted some studies and found that you get the highest yields with 8 or 10 inches between plants. So go ahead and plant them closer together. And then the space between the rows is just dependent on equipment. So at the research station, they leave 6 feet between rows because that's what they need for their mechanical cultivation and equipment, but 3 feet or even less, if you don't need to get in there at all, is acceptable. As soon as you put those slips in the ground, you got to water them in. And you really need to keep them moist but not soggy during the first 3 weeks of establishment. If you let them dry out early, then you won't get survival of the slips. Don't worry if your slips look mostly dead. They usually come right back. Or not right back, but after 2 or 3 weeks, they'll start putting on new growth.
Just to give someone's asking about like specific dates that all this stuff would happen. So I'm in Mount Vernon, and we started our slips. I started some of them in mid-March, but really I try to get them all started by about early to mid-April, and then I target planting around June 1st.
And to add to that, yeah, so June 1st is a great time, but it's been really interesting working with farmers over the past 2 years. And there's one farmer that we work with that doesn't plant theirs out till the first week of July. They actually, after they harvest their garlic, then they put in their sweet potatoes. So and they pre-root their slips, but in their microclimate, they don't harvest till late October either. So it just depends. There's other folks that we've run into that put their sweet potato slips in the ground in early or mid-May. It just depends on your microclimate. So pay attention to soil temperature and air temperature. For field preparation, 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre. I know that doesn't translate well for some of you guys that may be gardeners or smaller farmers, but basically you would fertilize sweet potatoes like you would potatoes. They're not a high nutrient needing crop, so light fertilization is okay. If you over fertilize them, you'll just get a lot of vines and leaves and not many roots, and I think it's the roots that most people are after. So be careful with the fertilizer. If you can, we recommend raised beds just because you get a little bit more soil aeration. But last year, I worked with somebody who planted them directly in the ground without mounding it up, and they were fine. It was just a little bit harder to dig them. You can use black polyethylene mulch. If you have a bed shaper mulch layer, you can use the 1 millimeter polyethylene mulch, but other farmers are trying recycled silage tarps, wood chips, no mulch, floating row cover, high tunnels, greenhouses. It depends on what your resources are. Folks are using the recycled materials. Oh, I didn't put weed cloth on there. Some people are using black weed cloth as well. So it just depends on the resources you have, and whether you want to use single-use plastic or have something that you can use again and again. Um, I just want to put a note that although some people are trying wood chips, we do not recommend it. And the person who tried it, or people who tried it, didn't have good luck because wood chip mulch actually cools the soil instead of warming it. So stick with those techniques that will warm your soil. And I added the floating row cover. We haven't had farmers try that yet, but this coming season, there's going to be one farm trying that. Other folks have used kind of low, thin plastic tunnels, and then they just rip out the sides as the plants grow. So whatever you use for your warm season crops, you can try with this. It just helps to get a little bit of extra heat if you're not in a nice warm area. I did notice that there was somebody on from Spokane County, and out in Spokane, you may not need any of these warming techniques.
Laurel, there's also a question about what kind of planting date we'd use if you were using a hoop house.
That's going to depend on your conditions. I would just go ahead and keep an eye on the soil temperature in particular. So yeah. Okay, for field management, irrigation, if you're using plastic, you can use drip irrigation. Well, you can always use drip irrigation, but if you're using some type of mulch, you'll need it. Just keep the soil moist. At the research station, I think you guys typically do like half an inch of water a week, but it just depends on your soil type. If you water too much, that also can impact the root growth, and you'll get smaller roots and more foliage. So just keeping the soil moist down to 6 inches is a great way to go. Don't water more than you need to. At the same time, you need to water consistently. This picture here are sweet potatoes that were grown on a local farm. If you let things dry out and then you water, they'll crack, and we don't want that. It seemed like some sweet potato varieties are more prone to cracking than others, but for best results, keep up with regular moisture and just don't let them get too dry. For weed management, there is a critical weed-free period in the first 2 to 6 weeks. So after that, we hope the vines are starting to take over. But even if you're using plastic mulch to plant your sweet potatoes, you have to really make sure that you aren't getting a bunch of weeds coming up from the planting hole, because that's a kind of a non-starter if the weeds get ahead of your slips. So just remember that the critical weed-free period is 2 to 6 weeks. So for harvesting, sweet potatoes are actually a perennial crop in tropical areas where they typically grow, and they harvest the roots and the greens year round as they need them. But here, we grow them as an annual, and we harvest them anytime the roots are large enough. And usually you want to give them as much time as you can because because we have a shorter growing season here. So you just harvest before the soil temperature drops below 55 degrees. And that's just because they won't store as well if they experience colder temperatures than that. And let's see. Yeah, so when you harvest them, we just cut the vines before. You can see in this picture, cut the vines, pull them to the side. If you have livestock, you can go ahead and give those to your livestock or chickens for a nice treat. And then while you're harvesting, just try to minimize skinning and bruising and stabbing them with forks and things like that. If you're harvesting them by hand with a shovel or a fork, it just takes a little practice to kind of figure out where the sweet potatoes are going to be under there. You can see these sweet potatoes here are kind of in these nice clumps, but there's some varieties that where they'll travel a little bit more. So you just have to figure out with the variety you're doing, how far out to dig so you don't stab them. And you'll probably get to know that sound, that stabbing sound, the crunching sound of the fork piercing your sweet potatoes, but hopefully not many of them. All right. For curing, sweet potatoes absolutely need curing. So you don't want to wash them, just brush off the extra soil. And then you can see here, this is the setup that Laura has at the research station. She puts them in stackable crates, and they're thin layers in the crates, so they're not packed in there really tight. And then this is the second process that requires higher temperatures than probably anything else you do. So you'll need 80 to 90 degrees, high humidity, and it takes 7 to 10 days if you have those conditions. So you can see in this picture, there's a space heater. It's a pretty small room. There's a humidifier, and then a fan for circulation. If you can't get those optimal temperatures, it just takes longer. If you're doing this at home, or if your farm just doesn't have a great spot to do it, if you have 65 to 75 degrees, it will just take 2 or 3 weeks. So some other important parts of this in this process, you can set up, this is just one example of a way that you can do it. They just happen to have a spare, I don't know, closet or storage room, but you can also we've had folks make a frame out of PVC and lay plastic over it, and then use the heat mats that you would use for seed starting. That can be sufficient. There's other people, who do this at home that might dedicate a closet in their house to this. But you can just do, trial and error, and see what works for you. Another important thing is you don't, if you're really packing your harvest in there, you have to be careful about not getting any of them too close to the heater, or not getting the temperature too high in the curing chamber. We've heard horror stories from farmers that open the door and they smell cooking sweet potatoes, and that is not a good thing. So just be mindful that, like this photo, keep the heater away from the sweet potatoes, and make sure you monitor the temperature until you know how to manage it. Oh,
We have
yeah.
a question about washing the roots after curing. I guess I would recommend waiting until you're gonna eat them to wash them. I don't even wash them during storage. I think just washing it's gonna just increase the susceptibility of rot if you're gonna be storing it for a long time. But if you're about to sell them, you could, yeah, probably wash them after curing. But just make sure the surface dries out.
Yeah. And I think you'll find once they're dried, it's really easy to brush the soil off of. So yeah. This other picture, this is a different kind of curing chamber, where it's just a PVC frame with plastic. This type of chamber is also used for propagating sweet potato slips as well. So it's a dual use thing. It doesn't have to be clear plastic, of course, for the curing. For storage, ideal is 55 to 60 degrees with higher humidity and darkness. If they spend too much time below 55 degrees, you can get some chilling injury. And if it's too warm, they'll sprout eventually. You want some ventilation. We have actually Carol, who's the director of the research station. She stores hers at home in the garage. So if you have a garage that doesn't freeze, then you can give that a try. And if they're cured properly, they'll store at least for 6 months. And I forgot to say, Okay, yeah, the curing process sets the skin, heals wounds, and enhances the flavor. It's actually, the curing process helps convert the starch to sugars. So eating eating fresh sweet potatoes, is not recommended. Wait until they're cured and then they'll get that sweetness that you're used to. Okay. Having a little delay in the presentation here. So here we go. I'm going to turn this over to Laura because she's going to talk about some of her trials.
Sure. So I think Laurel mentioned at the beginning, sweet potato greens are edible. So they're considered a very nutritious leafy green. They can be used as animal feed. They're very high in protein, especially compared to other leafy greens. We generally describe the eating quality as pretty similar to spinach. They do have a pretty different flavor than spinach. They're certainly a lot less bitter. They almost have a slightly floral flavor. So I really like them. I think they taste great as far as leafy greens go. Generally for human consumption, people prefer just the vine tips, though you could also cut off the leaves, but some of the older stems tend to get pretty tough and are not preferred for eating. Laurel, you can go ahead to the next slide, I think. So I am working on a trial looking at harvesting sweet potato greens as a secondary vegetable crop and looking at if that, like how much of an impact that would have on root yield if you were to harvest both greens and roots from the same plant. We do expect that there's, always going to probably be an impact on root yield if you're harvesting greens during the growing season, but we were trying to see if maybe harvesting them early in the season or late in the season would maybe have a different impact on root yield. So in this graph here, you can see along the bottom is the three breeding lines we included in this trial. You don't have to worry about those, but the blue bars show the root yield you get if you don't harvest any greens at all. So that's kind of like your standard root yield. And then the orange bar shows if you harvest sweet potato greens early in the season, which for this experiment was 8 to 12 weeks after transplanting. So that was pretty much throughout the month of August after a planting date on June 1st. And then the gray bar shows if you were to harvest them only late in the season, so only in the month of September. And then the yellow bars are showing if you were to harvest them August and September. So the main takeaway from here is all of the gray, orange, and yellow bars are pretty low compared to the blue bars. So you are going to lose a lot of root yield if you decide to harvest greens during the growing season. However, the later season does have less of an impact on root yield. So if you are interested in harvesting greens, we would recommend that you only harvest them later in the season. So maybe wait till like September, or if you want to harvest them early, just harvest pretty minimally. In this experiment, we were harvesting the vine tip off of every single vine on every single plant. So that's something we did for, research methods, consistency of data, but you could certainly just harvest some of the vines, and that's going to have less of an impact. And then the other thing to consider is if you were to only harvest your greens like right at the time of root harvest, like maybe 2 or 3 days before, you're not going to have any impact on root yield. So you could consider just harvesting vine tips right at the very end of the season, right as you're getting ready to cut the vines. So you could harvest vine tips for human consumption at that point, or you could also just cut the entire vines and feed them to livestock. Do you want me to talk about this, Laurel, or are you gonna?
I can go ahead and do it. Thanks. Okay, so we wanted to talk a little bit about some pests of sweet potatoes because that will impact impact your production. Wireworms are one of the primary pests that are hard to deal with on organic farms. These are larvae of click beetles, and they can actually impact any of your crops. But we're talking about sweet potatoes. So the feeding scars are you can see in the picture here. They're if the roots were fed on early in the growth, you'll see these scars that are kind of spread out, and the damage that happens closer to harvest are these smaller holes. anyway, wholly produce isn't as desirable at the market. So yeah, even though the damage is only cosmetic, typically, particularly the older scars, they heal over pretty well, and even when they're really, really holy, this is all that you see inside. So for your own consumption, just keep that in mind and don't mind ugly sweet potatoes, but we know for marketing, it's harder to convince customers. Sorry, we have a delay again. There we go. So one way that we're trying to address sweet potato wireworms and sweet potatoes is looking for varieties that are more resistant. So it's a great option for organic and conventional growers, but for organic growers, it's one of your only options. So so in these pictures, there's a new here on the left is a wireworm resistant variety called Cascade that was just released from the breeding program last year based on data that was collected in Mount Vernon. And so they named it Cascade because it grows well here. This Covington is a susceptible variety, and it's one of the really widely grown varieties. So you can see that just because they're resistant doesn't mean they won't get any damage, but it's sure better than, this holy mess here versus one or two holes in a couple sweet potatoes here. So Laura also has trials trying other breeding lines. So there's one more, this USDA 04791, that's really promising in our area, and it's actually going through the release process right now, and we're hoping it will be available for the on-farm trials this year. These breeding lines, if you want to see them and compare them, we have a field day that happens at the end of August this year, so you can see them at the research station. But when they're still in process, the breeding process, they don't go off the research station. So keep an eye out for Cascade, and then this 791, I'm sure we'll come up with a creative name for that. Okay. This is a graph that Laura made from the research, and you can see the wireworm damage severity. So Beauregard and Covington are two of the most widely grown sweet potatoes, and they're really, really susceptible to wireworms. They're great varieties to grow here if you don't have wireworms. But these ones here at the bottom, Cascade, and then these breeding lines here, and this one actually too, are supposed to be wireworm resistant, and you can see the three down here are actually fare the best. And I mentioned the 4791 on the previous slide is one that's being released, and you can see why we want to release it, because it is the least susceptible to wireworms in our trials. Okay, so I just wanted to point out, here's that chart again that I showed earlier, except I added the breeding lines to it. And you'll see the harvest weight. So these more conventional varieties that are susceptible to wireworm, you get pretty high yields. But if you look at the wireworm resistant varieties, and particularly these ones down here, you can see that their yield is a lot lower than the ones that aren't resistant to wireworms. So if you don't have wireworms, you're going to do best by planting some of these other varieties that are susceptible, just because they have higher yields. So those are the low yields. But Laura made this great graphic to show you what the wireworm resistant varieties do. So if you have wireworms, you're going to be a lot better off growing these resistant ones. So this first part of the bar here that's in green, that is the true marketable yield. And then the orange is unmarketable due to wireworm damage. And then the brown or black there, that's just off shapes or damaged or otherwise damaged ones. But you can see these wireworm resistant ones. When you have high wireworm pressure, these have the the highest, except for that one. I think this one we pointed out in the previous one is actually being susceptible. So this one and Cascade have the highest yield if you're dealing with wireworms. Okay, so other pests, we know that wireworms are a big problem here. There have actually been farms that have tried to grow sweet potatoes and quit because of wireworms, but there are other pests and diseases that can impact sweet potatoes. Cucumber beetle is one of them. I know that cucumber beetle, we didn't have much of it around here, and at least out in our tri-county area, Clallam, Jefferson, and Kitsap counties, we didn't have cucumber beetle at all until recently. I know it's coming, it's already here in other places, but cucumber beetles, the adults feed on the foliage, which they probably won't do enough damage to impact the root harvest, but the spotted cucumber beetle larva can also damage the roots. So if you have high pressure with cucumber beetles, just keep that in mind. But I would say any sweet potato that's resistant to wireworm damage is probably resistant to cucumber beetle larva damage as well. So deer and rabbits are are a major problem that we've encountered. You can see this, we held trials on a farm 2 years ago. And you can see these nice little footprints from the deer coming through, and these deer liked the sweet potatoes so much that they ignored everything else and went straight to the sweet potatoes, and you can see that they ate them down to the ground. Any significant foliage you see in this picture is actually weeds. There's no foliage on those sweet potatoes. So I didn't have a scale here, but these sweet potatoes, this is how many sweet potatoes got harvested from the highest yielding plants for this picture here on the right that had deer damage. And those sweet potatoes are like maximum an inch wide and maybe 2 inches long. And those are the biggest ones that they harvested. So take care of those deer. Rabbits, unfortunately, will do the same thing. So if deer fences 8 feet tall, for rabbits, I think a 3 foot fence is okay, and you should bury it in the ground a little bit. But for both deer and rabbits, we've had farmers report that floating row cover will keep them out. So that's a good option. Voles and rats can also be a problem. You can see in this picture here, after we removed the plastic at the research station, the voles actually, had these great tunnels and their burrows under the plastic. So the plastic protected them. This is a rat's nest. You can tell the difference between the voles and the rats, because the rats tended to make their nests right under the plastic, and then they dragged in all sorts of bits and pieces for padding. So if you have a lot of rodents, they can actually destroy a whole crop. But we found at the research station when we were harvesting this past year, it looked bad, but there were enough sweet potatoes that the overall damage was very little, even with all this tunneling and stuff. So so it just depends on your rodent pressure. Some tips for keeping voles and rats away are keeping the area around the field mowed and tilled. That's more a recommendation for voles. Encouraging raptors. Of course, if you have plastic to protect them, the raptors won't be able to get them when they're under there. And then depending on the size of your farm, you can also use traps. Okay, into diseases. The first disease that we've seen around here on sweet potatoes is called scurf. It's a fungal pathogen that leaves these like grayish brown black lesions on the sweet potatoes. It can be transmitted by infected soil, but also planting material. We had a farm report this getting this disease, and they had actually purchased slips from a big supplier, and that's how they got this disease. So if you can grow your sweet potatoes at home, you can grow your sweet potato slips on your farm or at home. then you can avoid importing a disease like this. So you should use certified roots or certified uh, slips that you buy. And then if you have scurf on your farm already, just make sure you clean your tools. But crop rotation is really effective for this because scurf doesn't infect any other plant family that you have crops on your farm. If you have a bindweed problem, bindweed can also be a host for scurf. So that's, you won't have problems with crops, but certain weeds, yes. Sweet potatoes can be susceptible to viruses. There's various viruses that infect them. Typical virus symptoms, stunting, mottling, things like that. This is going to be transmitted from importing plant material that's infected, or if it's a virus that can infect other crops, then it's those piercing, sucking insects that are the culprits, like leaf hoppers and aphids and things like that. So for management of viruses, just using certified roots, certified slips. If you start having a loss of vigor in your sweet potatoes slip production, that could be a sign of a virus as well. So you can purchase new roots for propagation stock, and then of course sanitizing tools. Okay, so in conclusion, we've covered a lot of material here, but you can grow sweet potatoes successfully in the Pacific Northwest. Some people are already doing it. Plant spacing, 8 to 10 inches, narrow spacing is okay. That gives you a higher yield per space that you have. Pay attention to watering, particularly early in the season in the establishment phase, but also just consistent watering through the season to avoid cracking. Weed control in the first 2 to 6 weeks is essential. Make sure you figure out how you're going to cure your sweet potatoes so they'll last long enough to sell and they'll taste better. The sweet potato leaves and vines are edible, but you don't want to harvest those throughout the season if your goal is to sell roots. We recommend harvesting them later in the season or just minimally. Wireworm resistant sweet potatoes are a great tool if that's a pest you have if that's a pest you have on your farm. And then deer, rabbits, and voles are the other really serious pests of sweet potatoes that we have around here. So in conclusion, thank you from both Laura and I. We do have a sweet potato growing guide that Laura produced this winter. The growing guide is going to be updated next year based on feedback from farmers. So we encourage you to go look for that. If you're somebody who does QR codes, you can use this QR code to go to the website at the Mount Vernon WSU Research Station, where you'll find the sweet potato page. And this is exactly what it looks like. There's a growing guide. This is more for researchers, but there's reports from past trials. If you're interested in plastic mulch and in-row spacing, there's a report there as well. But this growing guide is the main one that you'll be interested in. I also put a link to it in the chat box, and I'm going to put it in there again because I think some people arrived after I put it in the box. So now we're available for questions.
Hi, Laura, any recommendations on where to buy the slips?
Yeah, let's see. There's, sweet potato slips are becoming more common at many seed companies. There's some big producers in California and on the East Coast, but for companies that farmers around here typically buy from, I've seen them at Johnny's Select Seeds. I think Fedco has some. Territorial might have some. But I would just, those are just some examples. There are other seed companies that also have slips. It's just really important to look for the short season ones. And most good seed catalogs, if they're offering them, should tell you what the days to maturity are.
Thank you.
Yep. I'm just gonna take that down because I want to put I'm gonna put a survey in the chat box as well. Okay, chat box here. We really do appreciate your feedback. So, oops. So there's a link to the survey. There's just a few quick questions. We report back to SARE for our Western SARE for our grant. And we also like to know what we're doing that's helpful and what's not helpful, and any way we can improve. So we would really appreciate your feedback on that. So go ahead and fill out the survey. I'll try to email that to you as well. And if you have any more questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. Also, I can put back up the last, oh, there we go. If you want to email Laura or I directly, you're welcome to. Our emails are right there for you. So thanks for coming.
Laura, there was a question about interplanting sweet potatoes with other crops. My general thought would be probably not. Sweet potatoes they really need a lot of sun. They seem like they might be a nice ground cover because they kind of spread on the ground, but you're going to get such low root yields if they're not getting a lot of sun. I was actually talking to someone recently who's from Ghana and was telling me that they do interplant sweet potatoes there, but what they do is they actually grow sweet potatoes on a trellis. So the sweet potato is able to climb and is able to get access to light, and then they grow other things on the ground. So that's probably the way I would recommend doing it, but we don't have any experience doing that, so we can't. In general, I'd say probably not interplanting.
Yeah. And Laura, I think you mentioned that you were going to kind of do an unofficial trial at the research station of growing sweet potatoes on a trellis. So I'm really excited to see how that goes.
Yeah, so if anyone comes to our field day in August, you should hopefully be able to see us trying sweet potatoes on a trellis. We'll let you know at that point how it looks.
Yeah, and we scheduled the you can find out about the field day through the Regional Small Farms newsletter. And let's see, did we say, was it the 30th, right? I think we scheduled it for August 30th.
I think so.
But we will advertise it through the Regional Small Farms newsletter. And then any outlet that you found out about this through you'll also get information about the field day. So we hope you'll join us. I was also going to say, we did have a farm last year that participated in the trials, and they tried growing them in the greenhouse as an understory under their tomatoes. And it was a small greenhouse, a small farm. And they did not get great root yield, but it was hard to tell whether the low root yield was due to lack of light, or tomatoes need a lot more nutrients than sweet potatoes do. So it could be that they had the problem where the sweet potatoes got too much nitrogen, so they produced more leaves than roots. So you can go ahead and try it, but I'm kind of excited about the trellis option. Other questions?
I have a question. So we have an opportunity to sell as many sweet potatoes as we can grow for a great price per pound, but our customer really wants us to wash them. And my wonderful coworker asked a question about washing earlier. But I was wondering, they really don't, they're not, when I'm like, oh, well, we'll just like brush off the dirt. They're like, no, we really need you to wash them. So, any advice? I feel nervous to wash them after curing. It feels like
So,
ruin it, but yeah, any more information would be super helpful.
so what I can tell you for my experiments, I have to wash them for for some of the data collection that I do. So in that case, I do wash them before curing. I can tell you that they cured fine and they stored fine. I think there was a slightly higher incidence of rotting than in the unwashed roots, which is why we recommend not washing them. Um, but the vast majority of them did cure fine and they did store fine. The main thing is just make sure the surface completely dries out before you put them in a curing chamber. You don't want to be putting wet roots in a really humid place. That's going to cause rot, but as long as you let them dry out. So I think I usually hose them off and then let them sit in a shady spot in crates for a couple days so they're totally dry. And then I move them to a curing chamber.
Good information. I imagine if you had a space where you could put a fan on them too, that would help get them drier quicker. But yeah. So I guess you can wash them.
It looks like there's another question about pruning the vines to encourage root growth. So I think that's probably would fall along the lines of our experiment on harvesting greens, and it would be something that it seems like is actually really going to hurt your root yield. So we would not recommend that. The problems with the vigorous vine growth, it seems to be when there's too much irrigation or there's too much fertilizer and the plant just stops. It doesn't even, focus on producing roots at all. It's just focused on greens, but we wouldn't recommend pruning to try to get that to happen.
Yeah. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, you guys have our email addresses, so feel free to reach out to us directly. We definitely are very interested in hearing your experiences growing sweet potatoes. Feel free to ask us questions. We really want this research to help farmers and be informed by farmers. That's an important part of this. So we're looking forward to hearing back from you and getting your questions.
Thank you very much for doing this. This is super helpful.
Sure, anytime.
If you're looking to access any of the wireworm resistant material that you're not gonna be able to purchase that anywhere, you'll want to reach out directly to one of us and we can get you some slips or roots.
Right, good call, Laura. Yeah, we want to get the, and then we don't, I'm not sure who these varieties would be sold by. So this is a case where these wireworm resistant varieties that we provide to you, they're not patented. So you're welcome to keep them and perpetuate them and produce slips on your farm.